The soft evening light filtered through the small square window of the grandmother's old traditional home, casting long golden shadows across the worn wooden floor as she sat quietly in her rocking chair, the motion slow and rhythmic, almost blending with the hush of the fading day. And her grandchild sat cross-legged on the rug before her, small hands wrapped around a warm cup of milk, eyes wide and curious as though the entire world rested in the next sentence she would speak. And for a long moment she simply watched the child, her wrinkled fingers resting on the armrest. Fingers that once carried weight no one saw, stories no one knew, burdens no one thanked her for. And when she finally exhaled, it was the kind of breath that came from deep inside a person who had lived through storms and still found the courage to sit in the quiet. Because the quiet was sometimes the hardest part, and she lowered her gaze to her hands, turning them slightly as the dim light revealed every wrinkle like a map of years that had shaped her into who she had become. And the child leaned forward a little, sensing that today's story was not going to be like the usual ones about sunshine mornings or recipes or simpler memories, but something heavier, something that made her voice tremble at the edges even before she began. She cleared her throat softly, and the rocking of the chair slowed until it almost stopped. And then she said, in a tone as fragile as it was strong, "There are things I never told anyone. Not because I didn't want to, but because no one ever asked." And the child's eyes grew even wider, tiny fingers inching toward her hand, as if instinctively wanting to hold it before the sadness inside her words could spill out any further. And when their hands finally met, her fingers curled around the child's small palm with surprising gentleness. And she closed her eyes for a second, as though gathering pieces of herself she had scattered over decades. Pieces shaped by loss, betrayal, unspoken pain, and the occasional miracle of hope appearing when she least expected it. And she began speaking again, her voice deeper now, steady despite the tremble in her heart, telling the child about a time when she was young, far before the lines on her face had taken their rightful place, before the grey in her hair had settled as a permanent guest. A time when she had dreams so big they frightened her, and yet she followed them with a courage she would later forget she ever possessed. She spoke about growing up in a house that was full of people, but still somehow lonely, where she learned early that love was not always spoken aloud, and that silence could hurt more than shouting. And how she worked from the moment she could carry anything with her hands: firewood, water buckets, laundry, the weight of expectations, and the child listened, imagining a younger version of her running barefoot through dusty paths, her hair black and long, her eyes bright and unburdened, until life began handing her tests she was far too young to understand. She described the day she lost her mother, the way the sky looked unbearably blue as if mocking the heaviness inside her chest, and how she stood at the doorway of that small childhood home, feeling like the world had suddenly become too big and too empty at the same time. And the child's grip on her hand tightened in instinctive sympathy, because even in their innocence, they understood what it meant to lose someone who held the world together. The grandmother's voice wavered only slightly as she continued, painting memories so vividly that the child could almost see the scenes unfolding in the dim evening light, flashbacks appearing in the mind like pieces of an old film reel, her carrying the responsibilities her mother left behind, caring for siblings who were too small to remember their mother's face, working long days that blurred into longer nights, learning to hide her tears because crying never solved anything, and because the people around her needed strength more than they needed honesty. And she told the child how she eventually learned to smile even when she felt broken, because sometimes smiling was the only armor she had. She spoke of love too, not the fairy tale kind the child read in books, but the real kind, flawed and complicated. The kind that brought warmth on some days and bruises on others. And she told the child about the man she once trusted, The man who made promises with eyes full of tenderness, but hands full of storms. A man she thought would protect her, but instead taught her the meaning of endurance. And the child, though too young to fully grasp the complexity of heartbreak, felt a strange ache in their chest as her voice softened into a whisper when she said that loving him was like holding fire, beautiful for a moment, devastating for a lifetime. She described the nights she spent awake, listening to the wind pushing against the thin walls of her young home, wondering if the world outside was trying to warn her or comfort her, wondering if she had made a mistake that would shape the rest of her life. And she admitted that she stayed far longer than she should have, because leaving felt like failure, because she had been taught that endurance was a virtue, even when it slowly stripped pieces of her soul away. She paused as if reliving the decades-old exhaustion in her bones, her thumb brushing the child's knuckles in slow circles, grounding herself in the innocence before her, in the softness she wished she had known back when she needed it the most. The evening deepened into a soft violet hue outside the window as the grandmother continued her story, the shadows in the room lengthening slowly like memories stretching across time, and her grandchild shifted closer, resting their small head gently against her frail knee, as if anchoring her to the present while she drifted into a past that still tugged at her heart. And she breathed in slowly before continuing, her voice soft but steady, carrying the weight of decades yet still fragile enough to tremble in the quiet room. She said that after those difficult years, when she finally found the courage to leave the man whose harshness had chipped away at her spirit, she entered a new chapter that demanded a strength she didn't yet know she possessed. Because freedom, she explained, was not peaceful at first. It was loud, frightening, unfamiliar, like stepping into cold water in the middle of the night, and she had 2 children then. 2 little souls who depended on her for every smile, every meal, every sense of safety. And she remembered the nights she lay awake wondering where she would find the money for rent or food or shoes when their tiny toes poked out of the seams. Wondering how she would stretch a handful of coins into a week's worth of necessities. And the child looked up at her, eyes filled with awe, unable to imagine a world where their gentle grandmother had once lived through such storms. She told them about the small apartment she rented on the outskirts of town, a cramped place with peeling paint and a temperamental stove that refused to light unless coaxed like a stubborn old friend. But to her it was a sanctuary, because no shouting filled its walls, no threats, no tension, only the soft breathing of her children as they slept beside her on a mattress too thin to ignore the springs beneath, but thick enough to cradle her with the comfort of peace. And she remembered how sometimes she would sit by the window after they fell asleep, watching the city lights flicker and wondering if this new chapter would lead her towards something better or merely exhaust her into another set of struggles she would face alone. But hope, she said, had a stubborn way of surviving inside her, even when everything else felt lost, and she worked days at a diner where the smell of frying oil clung to her clothes, and nights cleaning offices where no one knew her name, and mornings delivering newspapers before the sun even rose, her feet blistered, her eyes heavy, but her heart refusing to quit, because quitting would have meant her children would have no future to inherit. The child raised their head slightly, their brows furrowed as they tried to imagine their grandmother walking through cold early mornings, her breath fogging in the air, clutching stacks of newspapers with hands that now trembled simply from age. And the grandmother smiled at the child's expression, smoothing their hair lovingly as she continued, telling them how sometimes she would come home so tired she could barely stand. But the moment her children ran into her arms, the exhaustion melted away like frost under sunlight, and she realized then that love, even when silent, even when burdened with responsibility, could become the very force that carried her through the darkest days. She paused for a moment as a memory flickered across her eyes, and she began describing a winter unlike any other. one where the cold crept into the bones of the house and into her own bones as well. When she came home from work one night to find a notice taped to the door, rent was increasing beyond what her thin wages could manage. And she remembered sitting on the floor that night, her back against the wall, pulling her sleeping children onto her lap as if she could shield them not just from the cold but from the realities of life she never wanted them to face. And she admitted to the child that she cried then, silently, tears slipping down her face while she held her children close, because for the first time, she wasn't sure she would win the battle she had been fighting so long. But then, she said, something inside her hardened, not in a cold or bitter way, but in the way metal strengthens under pressure, and she decided she would not let life defeat her. And with that determination, she began taking extra shifts, learning new skills, saving every spare penny until she could move them into a slightly better home, a place with warm floors and sunlight that entered like a blessing. And the child's small hand reached for hers again, holding it tightly as if wanting to travel back in time and help the younger version of her carry those burdens. The grandmother chuckled gently at the gesture, the sound soft and cracked with age. And she said she wished she could tell her younger self that everything would one day be worth it, that the pain she carried would eventually become strength, and that one day she would sit in a warm room with a grandchild listening lovingly to every word. But life rarely allows such reassurances in the moment, and so she walked forward blindly, one step after another, letting determination guide her even when fear trailed closely behind. She then spoke of the years when her children grew older, when they began helping her in small ways that meant everything: her daughter folding laundry without being asked, her son walking beside her on dark mornings as she delivered newspapers, telling jokes to make the cold seem less cruel, and she remembered how those little acts of kindness stitched pieces of her heart back together. Yet, she admitted with a tremor in her voice, life still had hardships waiting for her, because children grow, and they change. And sometimes the very love she fought so hard to protect transforms into distance she never expected. And the child stared up at her with confusion, sensing the heaviness beneath her words but not fully understanding it yet. And she continued, explaining gently that sometimes, despite all the sacrifices and all the love given, people forget. And sometimes their hearts drift in directions that leave you standing alone just when you thought you had finally earned rest. The child leaned closer, resting a small hand on her knee as if silently telling her she wasn't alone now. And the grandmother placed her other hand over the child's, her eyes glistening with a tenderness that held both gratitude and sorrow. And she whispered that the hardest heartbreaks in life do not come from strangers, but from those you once carried, fed, protected, and dreamed for. But she would tell that part of the story later, when the child was ready, when her own heart was steady enough to revisit the wounds that never fully healed. Night had fully settled outside the small traditional home. The sky now a deep indigo sprinkled with faint stars barely visible through the old window pane, and the warm glow of the lamp filled the room with a golden hush as the grandmother shifted slightly in her rocking chair, her joints stiff but her spirit still carrying the strength of someone who had weathered too many storms to be defeated by time. And her grandchild, still leaning against her leg, blinked slowly, absorbing every word with a seriousness far beyond their years, as though they instinctively understood that what she was sharing was not just a story, but a legacy carved out of pain, endurance, and the silent kind of love that asked for nothing in return. She inhaled deeply, her chest rising with the effort, and continued her story, her voice weaving through the room like a soft thread binding the past to the present, telling the child that even after all those battles, even after she had raised her children with everything she had, every breath, every coin, every piece of her heart, life was not finished testing her, because the most painful part of her journey came not from hardship or poverty or loneliness, But from the way time changed people in ways she never imagined. And she looked down at the child with an expression that was both tender and tired as she explained that when her children became adults, they slowly drifted from her in ways she could feel like cold wind against her soul. Subtle at first, then painfully obvious, and she described how her daughter moved to another state for work, promising to call every week, but weeks became months. And calls turned into occasional rushed conversations where she could hear the distance growing like a wall neither of them knew how to break. And though it hurt, she accepted it quietly, convincing herself that at least her daughter was safe and living the life she once prayed she could offer her. But her voice faltered softly as she spoke of him. Her son was different, because she had leaned on him in her later years, believing the bond they shared was unbreakable, believing he remembered the nights she stayed awake sewing clothes for him, the mornings she went hungry so he could eat, the sacrifices she never once announced because that was what mothers did. They gave until they were empty and then found ways to give more. But when he married, things shifted in ways she was not prepared for. And she said gently, choosing her words with care for the child's tender ears, that sometimes love can blind people to the kindness of others. And her son, caught between loyalty to his mother and devotion to his wife, slowly began choosing distance. And it wasn't the distance of miles but of the heart, the kind that hurt in silent, aching ways. The child stirred, puzzled and saddened, tiny brows knitting as if trying to understand why someone would drift from a grandmother who spoke with such softness and loved with such devotion. And the grandmother smiled faintly at the child's innocence, brushing her hand over their hair as she continued, explaining that it began with small things: missed visits, forgotten holidays, promises postponed, and she forgave each one because forgiveness had become second nature to her. A habit formed from years of carrying burdens others never saw. But then came the day that truly broke her. The day her son sat across from her at her kitchen table, avoiding her eyes as he explained that he and his wife had decided she needed to pay rent if she wanted to continue living in the small house she had lived in for years. The house she had built with the very sweat of her youth. The house that still echoed with memories of the children she raised with trembling hands and relentless hope. And the child gasped, their innocent eyes widening in disbelief. And the grandmother nodded gently, not bitterly but with the acceptance of someone who had long run out of tears. She said he framed it as fair, as helpful, as necessary if she wanted to stay, and she remembered staring at him in that moment, searching his face for the boy she once fed with a spoon, the boy who once clung to her sari or wore dress hem when thunder frightened him, the boy whose tiny fingers once curled around hers with unwavering trust. But she could not find him, not in his eyes, not in his tone, not anywhere. And she realized then that sometimes you can raise a child with everything you have, and still life can reshape them into someone you barely recognize. She didn't argue. She never argued, because her voice had learned long ago that loudness was not strength. And so she simply nodded, quietly agreeing to the rent he named, $1,200 a month, a sum so high that even the walls seemed to exhale in shock. And she remembered walking back to her room afterward, closing the door gently behind her before allowing her knees to shake beneath her, sitting on the edge of the bed as the weight of the years pressed heavily against her chest, wondering if love always ended this way, not with betrayal, not with cruelty, but with quiet disregard that slowly chipped pieces off the heart without leaving visible wounds. The child's grip on her hand tightened faintly, their eyes glistening, and she squeezed back with a small, reassuring smile, continuing her story as though the memory still pressed on her ribs. She explained that she tried, for a while, to make it work, cutting her already small expenses even smaller, stretching every dollar until her hands ached, skipping meals again like she had when she was young, Except this time the loneliness felt sharper because the sacrifices she made were no longer for children who needed her, but for a son who no longer understood her worth. She told the child that she would sit alone in the evenings, counting coins she hid in a little tin box under her bed, the same box she once used to store tiny childhood drawings her children made for her. Drawings she kept for decades like fragile treasures, only to now replace them with folded bills that never added up to enough. One day, not out of anger, but out of survival, she decided she could not do it anymore. Her old heart could not keep bending without breaking, and she packed her small belongings, wrapped her photographs carefully, folded her clothes slowly as though each piece contained a memory embroidered into its seams, and she moved out quietly, leaving behind the house she had once built with dreams and sweat and laughter, leaving behind the echo of footsteps that no longer came searching for her. The child looked up again, confusion and hurt swirling in their young eyes as they whispered, "But where did you go?" And the grandmother smiled sadly, stroking their cheek with a trembling hand as she said she found a small place of her own, not perfect, not large, but peaceful, with sunlight that warmed her mornings and silence that no longer hurt but healed. And in that quiet she discovered something unexpected. Her son needed her more than she needed him. Because only days after she left, her phone lit up with missed calls 35 in a row and messages asking where she had gone, why she hadn't paid rent, when she would return. Messages filled not with love, but with the panic of someone realizing too late the value of what they had taken for granted. And she did not answer at first, not out of vengeance but out of exhaustion, because her heart was tired of speaking into a void where love was not heard. And she rested instead, allowing herself to feel peace she had not known for decades. The night deepened further, wrapping the small traditional home in a quiet stillness broken only by the soft creak of the rocking chair and the faint hum of the evening breeze brushing against the wind. "Oh, pain." And the grandmother's eyes, lit gently by the warm glow of the lamp, carried a softness that came from years of learning to find peace even in pain. And her grandchild, now curled slightly against her hip, felt the rhythm of her breathing steady, slow, like a lullaby from a different time while waiting for her story to continue. And she lifted her gaze toward the ceiling for a moment as though searching the shadows for memories buried deep in her past before she gently returned her attention to the child and began speaking again, her voice holding that same delicate mixture of ache and wisdom that made even silence feel meaningful. She said that after she found her small new home, she expected the loneliness to be sharp and unbearable. But instead it came as a soft presence, almost comforting, like a long-needed rest after decades of carrying weights that were too heavy for one person. And she discovered that sometimes being alone was not a punishment but a quiet kind of freedom, the type she had never allowed herself to feel when she was constantly giving, constantly sacrificing, constantly trying to prove her worth to people who had long stopped noticing the depth of her love. And she remembered those first mornings waking up in her new place, sunlight stretching gently across the floor, no footsteps rushing past her, no demands, no tension, only the sound of her own breath settling into a rhythm she had almost forgotten belonged to her. She described how she slowly unpacked her things, one by one, as if handling fragile relics of her own history, placing each photograph with care on the small wooden shelf she found at a thrift store, smoothing the edges of old pictures showing moments she had lived so long ago that they almost felt like stories she had heard rather than memories she had made. And she traced her fingers over the faces in those photographs, her younger self smiling bravely, her children small and clinging to her, her mother standing behind her with a gentle pride, and she felt something shift inside her. Not sadness, but a quiet kind of acceptance that life, with all its storms, had still given her moments worth holding close. The child lifted their head slightly, the innocence in their wide eyes reflecting a kind of wonder as the grandmother continued, explaining that she began finding routines that soothed her soul: early morning walks when the dew still clung to the grass, afternoons spent tending a small potted plant she kept by her windowsill, evenings where she wore upon small scarves or stitched old torn clothes, the rhythmic movement of the needle calming her hands and her heart alike. And she remembered how, for the first time in a very long time, she felt a sense of peace that did not depend on anyone else's approval or affection, but came from her own ability to finally exist without constant noise around her. Yet even in that peace, she said, there were moments when the weight of what had happened pressed against her chest. Moments when she sat by the window at night, looking out at the streetlights and wondered how a child she had raised with such devotion could one day forget her worth so easily. And she did not speak this with bitterness but with a gentle sadness, like someone acknowledging a truth they had accepted long ago. And the child, sensing the heaviness beneath her words, wrapped their arms around her arm in a soft embrace, and she smiled down at them, a smile tired on the edges but full of love. She continued, saying that though she had chosen not to respond to the 35 missed calls at first, she eventually picked up when her son called on the next day, his voice frantic, not out of worry for her well-being, but out of fear of the responsibility her absence had left behind. And she listened quietly as he demanded to know where she was, why she had left without telling him, how she could abandon her responsibility, a word that made her laugh softly, humorlessly, because she had spent her whole life holding responsibilities no one ever acknowledged, and she calmly told him she was safe, that she was staying elsewhere, and that she would no longer pay rent to live in a house she had already given most of her life to. And his silence on the other end was long, heavy, a silence that revealed a sudden crack in his certainty, a realization that the person he had relied on to quietly shoulder burdens had finally stepped away from that role. She said he tried to argue, raising his voice in the way he rarely did when he was young, but often did now, as though loudness could rewrite the past, but she remained calm, speaking with a steady softness that disarmed him more than any anger could. And she explained that she had spent years giving time, giving love, giving health, giving sleep, giving her entire youth, and she was tired. Too tired to continue living a life where her worth was measured by what she could provide rather than who she was. And when she hung up the phone, she felt something she hadn't felt in decades, the quiet triumph of choosing herself. The child, still holding onto her, whispered, "Did he come to see you?" And the grandmother shook her head slowly, her eyes reflecting both sorrow and acceptance. And she said he did not at first, because pride, she explained, can build walls even love cannot climb. And people often cling to their pride far longer than they cling to compassion. But after a few weeks of silence, he finally arrived at her door, not with aggression or authority, but with a kind of defeated confusion, as though he had been forced to confront the truth that his mother was not an endless well of sacrifice after all. She said he stood there for a long moment, staring at her with eyes that seemed both unfamiliar and painfully familiar, holding a bouquet of cheap flowers that had already begun to wilt. And she opened the door and greeted him with a smile, not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but because love, no matter how bruised, still lived quietly in her heart. And he stepped inside her small home, looking around as though seeing for the first time the simplicity she found comfort in. And he sat across from her at the small table she kept near the window, the same table she drank her morning tea at, and for the first time in years, he looked at her not as someone who owed him something, but as a human being who had lived a life far bigger than he ever bothered to understand. She didn't scold him, she didn't cry, she didn't list the sacrifices she made, or the nights she spent worrying, or the years she spent holding everything together. Instead, she simply spoke to him gently, telling him her story, not the one he thought he knew, but the real one, the one filled with the pain she hid, the strength she carried, the battles she fought while protecting him from even the knowledge of them. And she told him that she loved him deeply, but she would no longer live in a world where love meant losing herself again. And for a moment, she said, she saw something shift in his eyes, not regret. Exactly, but a softening, the beginning of understanding, the beginning of recognizing her humanity. And though he apologized clumsily, awkwardly, in a way that revealed how unused he was to humility, she accepted his apology not because she felt obligated but because forgiveness, when given freely, frees the giver far more than the receiver. The child listened with awe, their small fingers tracing shapes on her wrinkled hand, and she continued, explaining that healing between them did not happen overnight, that years of miscommunication and distance could not be erased with a single conversation, but that small steps mattered, small gestures, small calls, small efforts, and over time, they built something new, something gentler, something more honest. And she was grateful for that, even if it came late, even if it was imperfect. Because love, she said, doesn't need perfection. It only needs sincerity. The evening deepened into a softer shade of amber as the grandmother shifted slightly on the woven mat, her frail back curving as though it remembered every season of struggle she had lived through. And the child beside her scooted closer, sensing that the story was thickening, becoming heavier, as if the air itself leaned in to listen. She inhaled slowly, her breath trembling just a little, and then she continued, her voice raw around the edges yet gentle enough to make the child's heartbeat slow in calm attention, telling how after leaving her son's house, after packing her few belongings into the small cloth bag that once carried his baby clothes, she felt both empty and strangely liberated. Walking down that lonely driveway with the last light of day falling behind her like a curtain closing after a long, exhausting play, and she remembered the exact sound of the gravel beneath her shoes. How each step felt like an apology she had never meant to give, because she had paid rent with her soul long before any money was involved. Yet her son had looked at her with eyes that belonged to someone else, someone hardened by convenience and comfort, someone who no longer remembered how she once stayed awake night after night just to make sure he ate, or breathed, or lived long enough to see morning. She swallowed the ache rising in her chest and told the child how the world felt different that day, bigger, colder, but also clearer, as though the sky had wiped itself clean just so she could see her life honestly for the first time in years. And she found herself walking slowly to the old bus stop with her heart pounding with both fear and a strange, new courage, sitting on that cracked wooden bench where countless tired workers and lost souls had sat before her, feeling the faint vibration of passing cars echo through her bones. And she whispered to herself, I still have dignity, even though the words felt foreign, like someone else had placed them on her tongue. And she recalled how the bus arrived with its tired engine and dusty windows, and how she climbed in with the same nerves she had on the day she brought her son home from the hospital. Except this time she was alone, clutching her bag as if it could hold the pieces of her that were left. And as she rode through streets filled with strangers, neon signs, and the dull hum of lives moving on without her, she felt a silent grief wash through her, realizing that her story, her sacrifices, her years had become invisible to the very person she protected most. The child beside her blinked slowly, overwhelmed but captivated, and reached for her hand, pressing it with that quiet love only children are capable of. And she smiled weakly, her aged eyes glistening, saying softly that even in that moment of abandonment, she forced herself to believe there was still purpose waiting somewhere. Maybe in a tiny apartment she couldn't yet imagine. Maybe in a moment of unexpected kindness, maybe in silence itself. because silence had never failed her the way people sometimes did. And she remembered stepping off the bus at the edge of an old neighborhood alive with the scent of bread from the bakery, the chatter of children playing tag, the distant ringing of a bicycle bell, sounds that felt like echoes from a life she once dreamed of. And she breathed in deeply, tasting the bittersweet nostalgia of a world that kept spinning no matter who got left behind. She told the child how she found a small room for rent above a florist shop, a room with peeling paint and a window that stuck when opened. But it was hers in a way nothing had been in decades, and she spent that first night sitting on the floor, surrounded by quiet, surrounded by the shadows of her memories, realizing that loneliness could feel strangely peaceful when it belonged to you and not forced upon you by those who should love you. And as she spoke, her voice wavered only slightly, but her words painted vivid scenes across the dim, warm room where she and the child now sat. Scenes of her gently sweeping the dusty floor of her new space. Scenes of her unpacking her folded clothes, laying them down carefully as if setting pieces of her soul back into place. Scenes of her making tea on a small borrowed kettle and sipping it while the moonlight poured gently through the window, illuminating her like a quiet blessing. The child leaned even closer, resting their small head against her shoulder, and she placed a tender kiss on their hair, continuing the story with a soft, trembling strength, explaining how the peace of that first night didn't last long, because the next morning her phone vibrated again and again. 35 missed calls from her son, his sudden panic filling the screen, his desperate attempts to reach her. Each call a reminder of how quickly regret grows when comfort collapses. And she looked at the child with a mix of sadness and wisdom, adding that sometimes people only see your value when they lose access to it, and sometimes losing you is the only lesson they truly understand. The room was quiet except for the soft rustle of the evening breeze drifting through the slightly open window, carrying the faint scent of flowers from the garden below. And the grandmother sat with her shoulders relaxed for the first time in years, though her eyes still held the weight of decades, a depth that no child could ever truly measure. And yet her grandchild leaned against her knee, their small hand wrapped around her weathered fingers, anchoring her to this moment, to this peace she had fought so hard to reach. And she began to speak again, her voice steady, soft, and thick with the kind of wisdom that only a lifetime of love, sacrifice, and sorrow could produce. Telling the child how after the 35 missed calls she had finally answered. Her son's voice had trembled with fear and guilt. How he had stumbled over words he had never used before, asking questions about her safety, her new home, if she was lonely, if she was hurt. And how she listened without anger, without raising her voice, because she had learned long ago that true power does not come from confrontation, but from quiet endurance and the strength to let others face their mistakes themselves. She told the child how she explained gently that she was safe, that she had chosen her own life for the first time in decades, and that though she still loved him, she would no longer let her life be defined by the neglect of those who should have cherished her most. And the child's eyes widened as they tried to imagine someone so small, so fragile on the outside, yet so impossibly strong inside, and she continued, describing the day her son finally arrived at her door, hesitant, uncertain, clutching a small bouquet that had begun to wilt. The very image of regret made flesh, and how she opened the door with a calm smile, the same smile she had once worn for her children when they were small and scared, and how she let him sit across from her at the tiny table where sunlight spilled gently across the floor. And she spoke quietly, recounting her story not to accuse, not to demand, but to make him see, to make him understand. To help him finally recognize the years of silent labor, of unseen pain, of sacrifices she had made so that he could live, grow, and thrive. And she described to the child the look in his eyes, The sudden recognition that he had never truly understood the breadth of her life, the depth of her heart, the weight of her patience, and how for the first time he realized that her value had never been tied to what she provided but to who she was. And how she forgave him not because she needed him to, not because she wanted to, but because forgiveness allowed her to step fully into the life she had claimed for herself. A life she had built from nothing, from courage, from heartbreak, from decades of enduring that which others thought she could not survive. And she told the child how in that moment she finally understood the truest kind of freedom. The kind that comes from no longer being defined by someone else's choices. The kind that comes from loving fully, protecting yourself fully, and embracing the quiet dignity of your own existence. And the child sat in awe, tracing the lines of her hands with small fingers, feeling the warmth and strength that pulsed quietly beneath her aged skin, imagining the years of struggle, the nights of tears, the mornings of endless labor. And yet the unbroken spirit that had survived everything life had thrown her way. She told them about how she had begun to enjoy mornings with her tea by the window, watching the sunrise illuminate her small garden, tending to each plant carefully, as though each leaf and petal reflected the resilience she had built over the years. And how she laughed softly when she realized that life, after all, had given her not just pain but the beauty of solitude, the gift of peace, and the chance to teach her grandson or granddaughter the lessons no one else had taught her. Lessons about strength, self-respect, hope, and love that endured even after betrayal. She described in vivid detail the evenings when the two of them would sit together, the child listening intently as she recounted her youth, the struggles, the heartbreak, the moments of triumph, the small acts of kindness that had kept her going. And she spoke of the times she cried quietly, alone, letting the tears fall on her hands or the bedspread, and how she had learned to live with sadness without letting it consume her, transforming grief into wisdom, pain into patience, and sorrow into a guide for living fully despite loss. And the child reached out to hold her face gently, as if to anchor her in that moment of peace. And she whispered softly that life would not always be easy, that people would sometimes fail you, sometimes betray you, sometimes leave when you expected them most. But the greatest victory was to rise every day, to continue loving, to continue giving, to continue living on your own terms, to continue speaking your truth, even if the world preferred silence.